Hi everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a light to medium weight denim. It has stretch across its width, none up and down, and I really like the colour of this one. And on to the cutting out. This is my front. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, 2 darts here, and I'm just notching their legs. I also have a notch for the underarm, and now just indicating the points of the darts with my pins and also the pocket placement, and then marking where the pin pierces the fabric with my chalk pen. And for the darts, I'm doing this on the inside. And for the pockets, on the outside. Now to mark in my dart legs, lining up my ruler with the chalk mark and the notch, and ready to pin. Matching up my notches, popping my pin in through that chalk line on the top, making sure it comes out through the chalk line on the bottom and back up through. And stitching here, starting at the bottom of the dart legs with a back stitch, following those chalk lines the whole way up and pulling my threads to finish. So that's the first one done. Same thing for the second. I've given those a good press, tied off my threads, and this is how they look. And now that that's done, I can move on to the pocket. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, and then I have a box pleat right in the center, and I'm marking here 3 notches, top and bottom, to indicate the folds of the pleat. And here, just pinching the fabric at those outermost notches and folding into the center, pressing, and doing the same thing on the other side. So that's my box pleat all pressed into place. Now to stitch down those folds. So I'm edge stitching right along that crease line, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, and I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the edge of the fabric. I'll do exactly the same thing on the other side, and that's how that looks. So now just to secure that pleat in place, top and bottom. So running a stitch line within my seam allowance, and this is just going to hold everything in place and make it much easier to work with. So I just need to finish my edges and press. So I ran those through the overlocker, and here just pressing in underneath by my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And on the bottom edge here, because my corners are getting a little bit bulky, I'm using my clapper just to press everything nice and flat. And then when I get to the top edge, I'm going to fold in underneath about 1.5 inches. So that's the pressing complete. Now to take care of that top edge. So the first thing to do is to fold that 1.5 inches back on itself so my fabric is right sides together, using that crease line I've just placed as a guide, and I'm going to stitch at my 1 centimeter seam allowance down both sides. This will just give me a nice neat edge at the top. I'll do exactly the same thing on the other side, and once it's all done and pulled through, this is how it looks. So I just have a couple more things to do to complete my pocket. The first of which is to run a stitch line at that 1.5 inch mark from one side to the other, using a little bit of a longer stitch length again, and this will just hold down that top edge and give me a nice decorative finish. Happy with that. And then the final thing I have to do is to put on my button, but before I can do that, I need to take care of the pocket flap. My fabric is on the fold and I'm cutting this out twice. So the first thing to do here is to add a little bit of structure. So I'm just pressing into place some interfacing, and this will just provide a little bit of support for the buttonhole. And now that that's done, I can stitch down that outer edge. I'm going to leave myself a gap here just so that I can pull everything through to the right side. So back stitching, moving my fabric along, back stitching again, and then here I'm just running my stitch line right off the fabric, then lining the side of my foot up with the edge of the fabric again and continuing the whole way along. This is just going to give me a nice crossover on that bottom edge, which hopefully will result in a nice accurate point. And once it's all been pulled through and pressed, this is how it looks. Happy with that. So now I want to close up that gap and also give a decorative finish to my pocket flap. So I'm going to run 2 lines of stitches from one side right along the bottom edge and up the other side again. So I'm starting a couple of millimeters away from that outer edge, using that same longer stitch length again. So that's the first line complete. And for the second, I'm about 4 or 5 millimeters away from the first line and just following it the whole way around. So now that just needs a good press, and the final thing to do to prep my pocket flap is to add my buttonhole. So I'm measuring up from that bottom point about 1.5 centimeters or so, popping in a little dot, placing my needle right on that dot and stitching. So that's my buttonhole all in place. Now to open it up. And then in an attempt to minimize fraying, I'm adding some fray check here. I've let that dry, and now that that's done, I can take care of the button for my pocket. So just lining up the stitch line on my pocket with the bottom edge of the flap, marking the bottom of my buttonhole, and then using these prim pliers in order to punch a hole right on my chalk mark. And for this dress, I've decided to use jeans buttons, and these come in 2 pieces, a little spike and the button itself. So I'm popping the spike through my punched hole, placing it on top of the button, and hammering it for my life into place. So that completes all of the prep work for my pocket and flap. Now to add it to my bodice. So I've pressed my center front nice and flat, and I'm just lining up that inner edge of the pocket with those chalk marks you seen me place earlier and pinning into place. And now because I have some shaping here around the bust and the waist, I need to be careful with my pocket placement. So to help me out, I've popped my sleeve roll in underneath, smoothed out my fabric over the top, being really careful, as I say, to keep that shape and pinning the whole way around. And to attach my pocket, I'm going to use the same finish as I used on the pocket flap earlier. So I'm going to run 2 lines of stitching right along that outer edge. I've given that a good press. Happy with that. So now for the flap, just pinning it into place, ready to stitch that top edge down. So this time just 1 line of stitching. So that's that done. So now that my pocket and flap are all attached, I'm ready to join my bodice front to my back at the shoulder. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch to mark the underarm point and at the top and bottom of the fold line. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching to start and to finish. So I finished my edges on the overlocker and given that seam a good press. And now that that's done, I'm ready to take care of the cuffs. So I have 2 pattern pieces here, the first of which is this one, so I have a little tab and I'm just marking the edge of the triangle there on the fold line. This will hopefully help me get a nice accurate point. Stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I'm doing the same thing here as I did on the pocket flap earlier. So I'm lining up my edges, running my stitch line off the fabric, lining up my edges again, running my stitch line off and lining up my edges again. And as I said, hopefully this will ensure that I get nice clean points on my tab. So I've trimmed my corners, pulled everything through to the right side and pressed. And this is what I get. And I want to give my tabs the same finish as I gave to the pocket flaps earlier. And I'll be using these to hold up my cuff, which we'll come on to in a second. So to do that, I'll need a buttonhole. So that's my tabs all prepped. So lining them up here with the shoulder seam. And before I stitch them into place, I want to take care of the cuff. So I have 4 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, a notch to mark the shoulder point, and the first thing to do is to join 2 of these pieces together along that shaped edge. So stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I just need to snip out that fabric at the point just to help it lie nice and flat, and press. And now the last thing to do to prep my cuff is just to run a stitch line along that straight edge just to hold those two pieces of fabric together. So stitching within my seam allowance, and this will just help to stop those fabrics from shifting about when I'm trying to add them to the bodice, which is what I'm going to do next. So lining up my shoulder notch, lining up the underarm points, and stitching here, this time at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, making sure that I'm catching my tab at the shoulder. So I just need to finish my edges and press. And now to help my cuff to lie nice and flat and sit tucked away neatly in underneath, I want to run a line of understitching. So I'm stitching through the bodice, through that finished seam allowance in underneath, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, and I'm about 1 millimeter or 2 away from the cuff. Now one final press, and then to finish the cuff completely, I just want to add one of those buttons. So this is a good little tip for marking the placement. So I'm just going to rub my chalk pen around the bottom of the button, pop it through the buttonhole and press it into place just to transfer the chalk. And I'll pop my button on off camera. So now that my cuff and tab are in place, I'm ready to close up my side seams. So starting at the waist at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And now the fabric at the underarm point here is quite bulky, so I'm going to trim that right back and run my edges through the overlocker and press. And this is what I get. Happy with that. So now my bodice is ready to be joined to my skirt at the waist. Starting with the skirt front, I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece. And I have pockets here as well, so I need to mark those in exactly the same way as I did the bodice earlier. So that's that done. And my pockets here are the same as the bodice, just a little bit bigger. I've assembled those in exactly the same way as I did earlier. And by the magic of editing, attach them. So now my skirt front is ready to be joined to my back at the side seams. My fabric underneath is on the fold, and I have 1 notch to mark on the waist at the fold line. My fabric is right sides together and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way down. So I'll finish my edges and press out my seams. And while I was at the overlocker, I also ran that bottom edge through it just to tidy it up. And now that that's done, I'm ready to join my skirt and bodice together at the waist. Lining up my notches, lining up my side seams and center fronts, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. my edge has been finished, my seam has been pressed. So now to take care of the placket. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, and the first thing to do here is to add a little bit of support and structure. So using that same interfacing I used before, I've just pressed that into place. So now this piece is ready to be joined to my centre front. Right side of placket to wrong side of dress. So I've just lined up my edges. I've pressed in underneath the hem of the dress and pressed up my seam allowance on the placket. Ready to stitch. Sewing at my 1 centimetre seam allowance the whole way down. I've pressed open that seam. I've also pressed in underneath the edge of the placket, and here just pressing the entire placket on top of the dress. And pinning into place. And I'm going to run a stitch line right around the perimeter of the placket. Starting at the hem, the whole way down to the neck. I'm using that little bit of a longer stitch length again. Across the neck and then right down that crease edge. Finishing at the hem with a back stitch. So that just needs a final press. And now that my placket is attached on both sides, I'm ready to take care of the hem. So I've pressed it up by my allowance and pinned into place. And here just running a little bit of a longer stitch directly through those overlock stitches from the centre front right the whole way round to the other centre front. That just needs a good press. So now that my hem is in place, my placket is in place, I'm ready to take care of the collar. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch to mark the shoulder and one at the fold line, top and bottom. And I'm cutting this piece out twice. I've added that same interfacing as before to one side, and on the other I've pressed up that edge by my allowance. This will help me out greatly when I come to add this to my dress, but for now, joining these two pieces together along that curved edge. Stitching at my 1 centimetre seam allowance. So I just need to trim down that curve. So folding my fabric at the seam line and snipping out a little triangle. I'll finish that off camera. I've given it a press, and I want to give this piece the same treatment as I did on the tabs and pocket flaps before. So I've ran those 2 lines of top stitching right along that outer edge, and now that that's done, this piece is ready to be joined to my dress. So lining up my centre back notch, my shoulder point and my centre fronts. and stitching here at my 1 centimetre seam allowance the whole way across. So I just need to press that seam up inside the collar, which you can see here, and now laying that pre-creased edge over the top of the stitch line you've just seen me sew and pinning into place. And stitching here using that same longer stitch length as before, sewing right along that crease edge, taking this nice and gently, trying to be as neat as possible. And now that just needs a final press. Happy with that. So to finish this dress, I just need to add closures. So I'm using a snap fastener on the collar piece, and then I'm using those standard little jeans buttons I used before right along the centre front. I've also added 2 concealed buttons and buttonholes, one above and one below the waist, and this will just help to keep everything sitting where it should be and prevent any gaping. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have that shaping around the fronts, my pockets, pocket flaps all in place, my cuffs with their little tabs and buttons, my collar nicely stitched down, those matching pockets on the skirt, my placket the whole way down the centre front, and that hem top stitched into place. And this is what it looks like on. So I am super happy with how this has turned out. I've tried to find a denim dress in the shops that is the right length, the right style, the right colour of denim, and I've never really been able to find what I wanted. This, however, fits so nicely. That little bit of stretch in the fabric is super comfortable. I'm very happy with the pockets, the placement, the fact that I still have that lovely bit of shaping around the front. Those of you that have been here for a while will know that this is one of my favourite types of bodice. I love that it just has the stand collar, the style of buttons, the length of skirt, and for those of you interested in patterning, I've shown how to pattern an A-line skirt in a previous video. I'll leave that linked below, and for the bodice, this is just the block as is. I shall leave the resource I used to draft this block in the description box, but as I say, I'm over the moon with this one. I know this is going to get so much wear.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!